This is the third in my series of three short lectures on the notion of debt and its cultural meaning. And in this lecture, we will focus on the marvelous short book by Mark Blythe called Austerity. Now, austerity as an idea is the government's response to debt crises, and it's essentially a form of belt tightening at a sort of national level. But the question that the idea of austerity poses is who should do the belt tightening, and how is that determined and legitimated at a cultural level? So, what Blythe talks about is the neoliberal response to the global financial crisis. And the larger question he raises is who should bear responsibility for this debt, where responsibility would mean both they should be blamed for it, and secondly, they should be called to account for it. And thirdly, it should be up to them to somehow fix the problem. If the banks created the crisis through irresponsible lending, then the question is why should taxpayers or citizens pay for their poor judgment? And probably in no other industry of the private sector, if they collapse, would the taxpayers be called upon to rescue them? That banking is deemed to be so critical to the economy, but also critical at the level of our everyday lives that the government cannot afford to allow the banking sector to collapse. In the UK, this question was compounded by the fact that the same bankers who, through their irresponsible lending, had lost billions of pounds were also paid substantial bonuses running to the millions of pounds out of the very money that was given to the banks in order to bail them out of their disastrous position. So the response to the debt crisis has been one of austerity. And although I'm talking about what happened in 2008, um, this is generally the kind of response by all governments to the idea of a debt crisis or a financial crisis, which is we have to tighten our belts, we have to reduce spending, and so on and so forth. And the question that we should be asking about this is always why must the poorest people pay for the excesses of the richest people? So austerity essentially means a voluntary form of deflation. It's a way of flattening the market through cuts to government spending, wage suppression, and the reduction of government initiatives. So it's the absolute opposite of the Keynesian model. The basic model is the household budget. If your credit card is maxed out, then you need to cut spending and pay it down. And this is touted as a sort of common sense way of understanding the economy. But it's completely false because government economies are not like a maxed out credit card because the one thing the government can do, which you cannot do, is print money. They can just simply print money and make more money, which is a form of inflation. But they can also demand that everybody around them contribute to help things out, namely in the form of taxation. So austerity is a way of managing a debt crisis that chooses to do neither of those things, to neither print money and cause inflation, or alternatively, raise taxes and therefore pay it off that way. And the sort of cultural and political question you should ask is why governments would want to avoid either of those two tried and true solutions. So, government is the biggest enterprise in any country. It's always the biggest game in town. So, if it slashes its spending, it causes the entire national economy to shrink. So, the paradox of this as an approach is that austerity tends to exacerbate the very problem it is intended to address. So, austerity is used when the market seems to be contracting, and the only thing it can do is cause that market to contract even further because it's sucking money out of the market. So, it's a very paradoxical solution. It's certainly not a good economic solution. So, the question we have to ask is why is it deemed to be a politically palatable solution? And so, as Blythe puts it, austerity is a dangerous idea. It sounds simple and sensible, and many people seem to think that it is both simple and sensible, but economically, it's dead wrong. So, why does it persist? The Australian economist John Quiggin has called it a zombie idea, because you can't kill it. No matter how often it's repudiated as a bad economic idea, it continues to hold sway. And partly it's because it seems so commonsensical that it's if you have a debt crisis, the only way you can solve that crisis is to stop spending and start saving and so on. But the minute you do that, you cause the economy to contract, and therefore you reduce your capacity to actually pay down the debt. But the government has decided to shoulder the burden of propping up banks that were too big to fail. They have then created a new problem in that they now have debts that are too big to bail. And many of the countries during the financial crisis, when they decided to prop up the banks, suddenly discovered that the debt burden was monstrous, that far greater than their own national economies, and became too big to deal with. So some countries like Cyprus, for example, took matters into their own hands and gave everybody's bank account a haircut. So people who had a certain amount of money in their bank were suddenly found that they just had several thousand euros skimmed off the top and with no recourse. The problem with austerity, as Blythe points out, is that everyone is trying to do it at once. So if a single country uses austerity, it might work, but if the global economy uses it, then it creates an even bigger problem. And this is a problem because what is debt for one group is income for another. So the global economy cannot function if everybody is tightening its belt at the same time, and that's what leads to depressions. So austerity is a bad zombie economic idea for three reasons, according to Blythe. First of all, it doesn't work in practice. Secondly, it relies on the poor paying for the mistakes of the rich. And thirdly, it only works, if at all, if no other country attempts it within the global economy, which of course doesn't happen. So Blythe's key point really is that austerity is unfair because it forces the people who can least afford it and who are, in this sense, the least culpable to pay for the mistakes of the people who can afford it and actually cause the crisis, namely the bankers. What's crucial from a cultural studies point of view is the way an economic and ideological argument is thus disguised as a moral argument. The moral argument, in turn, disguises the actual inequality of austerity. So the burden of national debt is not shared equally because not everyone's capacity to pay is equal. And as I mentioned in the first lecture, if 50% of everyone's income was taken into account, for some people that would leave them homeless. For other people, it would barely make a dent. So 50% as a flat rate is never going to be equal. Thus, the most powerful form of ideology is one that looks like morality, or even better, common sense, as Gramsci said, and this is what he referred to as hegemony. Hegemony is the idea that everyone knows to be true and therefore never questions. And during the global financial crisis, the idea of austerity certainly became hegemonic, and people did not question it. And the same thing happens now. Whenever a country announces that its deficits are too great, that it needs to somehow address that, the first thing it does is announce an austerity program, which involves cutting social spending and basically reducing welfare. In other words, making things much harder for poor people, whilst at the same time making things much easier for rich people by keeping down interest rates and enabling them to continue to borrow money to grow their businesses. So austerity is fundamentally unfair and unequal, and yet we treat it as though it is a morally, universally acknowledged truth.